So far, in the last couple of episodes, I've been discussing Pranay Lal's book Indica. And today, I come to the last part of it, where I'm going to discuss the journey of humans from Africa to India. I'm sure I'm not the first one to break this to you that ancient humans first came from Africa. And along their way, they populated Europe, Middle East, and on to India they came. From India, they went to China and even the Americas. So they didn't go directly from Africa to America, but from Africa to Asia and then to America. And how all this happened, let's just talk about that. And for that, we'll have to go around 200,000 years ago. That time, our species, Homo sapien that is, has just arrived. At that time, there were other Homo species as well. For example, Homo erectus was already there in India. But Homo sapiens were confined to a very small part of Africa, and it is here our story begins. So slowly and gradually, as the population of these species, Homo sapiens, that grew, the competition for food and shelter, that also intensified. And to make matters worse for them, seasonal rains, they have also become erratic that time. And East Africa and certain other parts of Africa had begun to dry up. So, in order to escape that misery, many bands of these Homo sapiens, they began to leave East Africa in search of new lands. They went to different directions. Some of them went towards south and populated South Africa. Some of them also went towards the western direction, that is the Central and Western Africa, where they settled in tropical forests. So there were these isolated communities of Homo sapiens in different parts of Africa. However, over time, many of these isolated communities could not grow any further, could not develop any technology, or could not sustain for a long time. Also, one must remember at that time, there was very little diffusion of new gene pool coming into these populations. And that is not very healthy in terms of evolution. Some of these groups, they also ventured across north through the Sahara landscape. I'm not saying Saharan desert because there was no desert back then. It was only in the next few thousands or tens of thousands of years that it was going to turn cold and it was going to turn into a desert. So, coming back to our timeline, just around 110,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, they had reached different corners of Africa, but they only survived in a few places where the climate was favorable to them. And in all these places, life was not really favorable. It wasn't comfortable for them. Without natural weapons such as claws or canines, they were more or less defenseless against powerful predators. Their eyes were like most of the other apes, and they were adapted only to see during the day, which meant they were going to be extremely vulnerable at nights. Of course, they had certain basic tools which they had built using stones, and they also had fire, but that wasn't always enough. So therefore, there was a constant struggle for survival. At the same time, evolution had blessed them in entirely different ways. Their bodies, their hands, they were very different. For example, due to their muscular and slightly plump buttocks, and they had good heels which were attached to the end of really long legs of bones Because of all these things, they could walk and run for long distances. They were not very fast compared to their predators, but when it came to stamina and going on for long distances, traveling through different climate conditions, they were extremely fit in that regard. And that really helped them while traveling from one place to another. At the same time, it gave them certain kind of advantage also while hunting. They had the tools in their hands, and at the same time they had evolved brains. And they could use these brains to develop certain kind of languages. One of the earliest languages was that of clicks, where they would just make sounds of clicks, just like this. These kind of clicks. This is really, really basic form of language, and it can still be found in many African tribes. The benefit of these earlier languages was that they could produce sounds in which they could communicate with the member of their own species, and sometimes with dogs and cats that were helping them in certain cases hunt. But many grazers like buffaloes or antelopes, they wouldn't hear those sounds. They wouldn't understand at all the meaning of these sounds. And that really helped. Of course, the languages too, over time, just like the other tools, they kept evolving, became more sophisticated, and human beings kept getting better with time. Now we come to the period around 80,000 years ago. The Ice Age, the last one of the Ice Ages that we know of, that arrived. And it had an immediate and a huge impact on how the life was growing on the earth. The ice sheets grew, of course, the ice spread, and the sea levels dropped. So therefore the climate was changing at that time. This was the time around 75,000 years ago when sapiens, they were trying to leave the shores of Africa. But at that exact point, something catastrophic happened in North Sumatra. Toba, a volcanic island, that exploded, and it is still considered as one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in the history of mankind. So what happened because of that was Homo erectus, which was, that species was there in pretty much different parts of India. They were wiped out. Some of them did survive for a considerable period of time after this explosion, but even they could not survive for long, because the flora and fauna and the temperature, all these conditions were changing at that time. So the last Homo erectus that we know of probably lived around 70,000 years ago, and that's it. And by that time, sapiens had taken their first steps towards India. And they took many different routes to find their new home. But the most successful route turned out to be the same one which Homo erectus had taken in the past. That is the coastal route. You might be wondering, how did they travel in the ocean for that long? They didn't have to, because it was Ice Age. And all these islands were sort of connected. If there was gap, there was very little. So it made that island hopping possible, and from the Africa to the Arabian coast and into the Iran and then the mountains of India, North India, they eventually got here. And as I said in the beginning, they not only settled here, populated different parts of India, but also from here they went on to explore different parts of China and then into the Americas. The interesting thing is, one of these tribes, the tribes that arrived in India 70,000 years ago, one of these tribes still survives till date. It's in Andaman Islands of India. So it's not just the history, but also the prehistory that is existing right in front of our eyes.